Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
It started the way these stories always start. Not with a bang, but with a quiet ache, one that builds slowly, year after year, until it becomes so familiar you don't even realize it's pain anymore. I was the firstborn, the so-called trial child, the one who came along when my parents still believed they could mold perfection out of expectation. But I wasn't perfect. I wasn't even close, not by their standards. I was too bookish, too serious, not smiley enough. I asked too many questions, stayed up too late, and never liked dresses. They didn't say it outright. No one ever does. But the message was clear from the start. Don't take up too much space. Be low maintenance. Don't make us worry. Then Melissa came along 3 years later, and suddenly there was light where I had always felt shadow. She was easy to love, loud, pretty, always in motion. She giggled on cue, cried when it was convenient, and loved bows and glitter and attention. My parents beamed at her like she'd hung the moon. I was the shadow beside her, the one who was always so mature for her age. Because I didn't throw tantrums when I got ignored. I just stopped expecting anything. I remember birthdays where she got cakes with her name and frosting, and all the neighborhood kids screaming in the backyard, while mine were a quiet dinner and a card with a 20 tucked inside. I remember my report card with straight A's sliding unnoticed under the fridge magnet, while hers, with its scattered B's and C's, was celebrated with pizza and new shoes. And it wasn't just once, it was always. I learned early that my achievements weren't shiny enough. They didn't photograph well. I became the background, the control group, the reliable disappointment who didn't cause trouble but never quite earned applause. I moved out at 20 and never came back for long. College gave me distance. Independence gave me peace. I didn't need them, and I thought, maybe one day they'd notice that I'd turned into someone worth seeing. But I could have bought a mansion in Malibu, and they'd still ask if I'd thought about settling down like your sister. Melissa, who got pregnant at 22 and married at 23, was already a mother of 2 by 30, with one more on the way. She worked part-time at a boutique and baked themed cupcakes for every PTA event. They called her the glue of the family. I was the guest star who only came home on holidays and left early without taking leftovers. I didn't resent Melissa, not at first. She didn't ask to be the favorite, but even as kids, she played her role too well. When Mom forgot to pack me lunch, Melissa would giggle and whisper, "I guess she just loves me more today." When Dad skipped my soccer game, but took her to the movies, she came home with popcorn in her hair and stories I couldn't compete with. Over time, it stopped being sibling rivalry and became a quiet war of presence. She filled rooms. I learned to leave them. So when the invitation to Melissa's baby shower arrived, lavender cardstock, gold embossed letters, RSVP by the 10th, I almost didn't go. I stared at it on my fridge for a week before I even opened it. It wasn't anger that held me back. It was apathy. I knew how it would go. I'd bring something tasteful, quiet, probably expensive. She'd open it last, maybe pretend to like it. Then someone else would bring something from Target with rhinestones on it and get 3 rounds of applause. I'd smile. I always smile. But something about this one felt different. Maybe it was the handwritten note at the bottom. Hope you can come. It'll mean a lot to Mom and Dad. Not that it'll mean a lot to me. Not it'll be fun. Just that it would matter to our parents. That stung more than it should have. I told myself I'd show up, stay an hour, and leave. I even picked out my outfit the night before. Dark green silk blouse, clean black slacks, heels just high enough to look put together, but not like I was trying. My hair in a low bun, neutral lips. The kind of look that says, I'm fine, I don't need this, but I'm here anyway. The day came and the house was already overflowing when I arrived. Pastel balloons lined the walkway, and the front porch had been turned into a photo booth backdrop with a huge glittery sign that said Baby Girl Number 3. Inside, Melissa was glowing, literally. She wore a flower crown, and a white lace dress stretched over her round belly. People buzzed around her like bees to a queen. My mother came toward me with that smile she always wore when she wasn't sure whether she was happy to see me or not. She hugged me briefly, then stepped back to scan my face, like she was checking for something she couldn't name. "Try to behave today, Claire," she said, like I was 13 again and about to start drama at Thanksgiving. I smiled. "Of course," I said. "Wouldn't dream of it." I handed over my gift, an engraved silver baby spoon, a handwritten note, and a trust bond for the child's future college fund. It didn't come in pink paper. It didn't squeak or make noise. It didn't photograph well, but it was thoughtful. It was what I do. No one noticed it in the pile. Melissa opened it eventually, barely looked at the card, and smiled for the cameras. Then came Mom and Dad's turn. They handed her a cream envelope. She opened it, gasped theatrically, and shrieked, "Oh my God, this is too much!" The room broke into applause as she stood and hugged them, mascara threatening to run. I leaned against the kitchen counter and sipped the champagne I had brought myself. Of course they hadn't stocked anything dry or decent. My mother turned to me, that same artificial smile on her face, and leaned in close enough for no one else to hear. "Maybe when you finally make us proud, we'll do the same for you." And those 10 words, hit me like an unexpected slap. Not because I believed them, but because for the first time in my life, I realized I didn't need to. I didn't owe them my silence anymore. I didn't owe them anything. I smiled wider, took a long sip of champagne, and reached into my purse. The envelope was thick, cream-colored, almost identical to theirs. I slid it across the table to my father without a word. He looked confused, then curious. He opened it slowly. His eyes moved from left to right, then back again. His jaw twitched. The color drained from his face. "Claire," he said, voice low, almost trembling. "You didn't—" But I had. And it was just the beginning. There is a strange silence that falls in a crowded room when something unexpected shatters the rhythm of the day. It's not complete, not total silence, but a perceptible shift. Like the collective inhale of a crowd watching a magician just before the trick is revealed. That was the feeling in the air when my father opened the envelope I handed him. The party kept going. Melissa was still laughing in the living room. A toddler somewhere was crying over a broken balloon, and a Bluetooth speaker droned on with some overplayed acoustic cover of a pop song. But at the table where we stood, time hiccuped. He held the paper like it was burning his hands. I watched his eyes dart back and forth across the lines, his lips moving silently as he read. His fingers trembled at the edges, not violently, but with the kind of shakiness that speaks of something deeper than physical reaction, something that cuts all the way through the bone and into the soul. I said nothing. I just waited. There was no satisfaction in my expression, no smug grin or biting comment. I had rehearsed none of this. I didn't need to. I had carried this moment with me for years. It had been simmering in my chest like water just below boiling, waiting for the right moment to rise. This wasn't revenge. Not really. This was release. My mother leaned over his shoulder, her smile faltering as she read the words behind his shaking hands. Her perfectly maintained lipstick, a soft mauve she wore to every family event, seemed too bright now against the sudden paleness of her face. Her hand found the back of his chair as if she needed support. I watched her eyes move down the page, watched her expression shift from confusion to disbelief, and then to something colder, recognition. She knew what it was, she knew what it meant. It was my will, not just a list of legal instructions or a bunch of dry paperwork. No, it was a statement. A carefully crafted, notarized, signed, and dated declaration of every boundary I had never been allowed to set in life. It outlined my assets, sizable, though you'd never know from the way I lived. I never bragged. I never flaunted. But over the last 15 years, I had built a quiet little empire. 2 startups, both sold for 7 figures, a handful of smart investments, a property or 2, and enough savings to retire early if I ever chose to. But more importantly, I had control. Control over what I left behind. Control over who benefited when I was gone. And none of it, not 1 cent, was going to my parents. The document made it clear in language both formal and unmistakable. Upon my death, all liquid assets, properties, and retirement holdings were to be divided among 3 charities, 2 focused on education access for underprivileged girls, and 1 offering legal support to survivors of domestic abuse. Personal items of sentimental value were to be given to close friends and former mentors. A small fund was set aside for my goddaughter, the child of my oldest friend, with instructions for a yearly letter to be delivered on her birthday. My sister wasn't mentioned at all, not because I hated her, but because she already had what she wanted. She had them, she always had. At the bottom of the first page, under a section titled Additional Notes, I had written a paragraph that wasn't required, but felt necessary. It read, "Since I have spent most of my life feeling like a guest in my own family, I see no reason to extend an invitation in death. This is not an act of malice, but one of clarity. I choose finally who gets to carry my memory." My father's mouth opened like he wanted to say something, but nothing came out. He just looked at me, a little glassy-eyed, not with tears, but with disbelief, maybe even guilt, though knowing him, it was probably closer to embarrassment. My mother finally spoke. "Claire, this is cruel. This is unnecessary." I tilted my head just slightly. "Is it, or is it just unfamiliar? I've never said no to you before. Maybe that's what feels cruel." She pulled her hand away from the chair like it had been burned. "You're being dramatic." That was always her favorite word for me, dramatic. Not passionate, not principled, dramatic. Because it was easier to dismiss me if my feelings were performative. I nodded slowly, finished the rest of my champagne in 1 measured sip, and set the glass down on the marble countertop beside a tray of untouched cucumber sandwiches. Melissa appeared in the doorway just then, face flushed with the glow of too much sugar and praise. She was holding a new set of baby booties and laughing at something someone had said in the other room. When she saw our faces, mine calm, theirs pale, her smile flickered. She walked over, holding the tiny shoes like a peace offering. "What's going on in here?" she asked lightly, then looked down at the open envelope. "What's that?" My father tried to fold the paper again, but his fingers fumbled. "It's nothing," my mother said too quickly. "Just something business-related." Melissa looked at me, confused but not concerned. That was the difference between us. She had never once believed she had anything to fear from me. Why would she? She had never had to. "Are you okay, Claire?" she asked. I smiled, and for once, it didn't feel forced. "I'm great, really. I'm exactly where I need to be." She furrowed her brow but said nothing more. The moment passed, as all moments do, swallowed by the endless forward motion of the day. Someone called her name from the living room. Another gift to open, another performance to give. She drifted away, back into the center of attention, back into the light. And I stood in the doorway, watching her go, with no resentment, no bitterness, just understanding. There was nothing left to prove. They had already made their choice. And now, finally, so had I. There is something peculiar about the way memory works when it comes to family. Certain images return, not in full scenes or logical sequences, but in sharp, isolated flashes, like old Polaroids that someone shoved into your hand without explanation. I remember the exact color of the wallpaper in the hallway outside my childhood bedroom, blue and yellow stripes that always made me feel like I was in a doctor's office. I remember the way my mother's heels clicked across the linoleum when she walked past my door on Sunday mornings, always heading toward Melissa's room first. I remember my father sitting in his recliner, one hand always nursing a glass of something dark, the other holding the remote, barely glancing up when I walked into the room. Most of all, I remember how quiet the house felt when I did something right. There was a period in my life when I chased praise like it was oxygen. Not because I craved the spotlight, but because I believed, on some stubborn, childish level, that if I could just find the exact right formula, if I could be good enough in just the right way, they'd finally see me. I joined clubs I didn't care about, volunteered for causes I didn't understand, practiced piano for hours every night until my knuckles ached. I brought home perfect report cards, performed in school plays, even won a regional spelling bee once, not that anyone remembers. My mother said, "That's nice, honey," and changed the subject. My father looked up long enough to say, "Make sure you're not getting cocky." Meanwhile, Melissa got a standing ovation for tying her shoes in under a minute. I used to think that favoritism was some big dramatic thing, obvious and brutal, like Cinderella sweeping ashes while her sisters danced at the ball. But that's not how it really works. Real favoritism is quiet. It's death by 1,000 small kindnesses given to one child and withheld from another. It's the way Melissa's mistakes were always forgivable, while mine were treated like character flaws. It's the way she got grace and softness while I got responsibility and silence. She didn't have to earn their love. She simply existed in the right shape for it. I had to mold myself constantly, only to be told I was still too sharp at the edges. When I left for college, I hoped that distance would soften things, that maybe adulthood would even the playing field. I thought if I could build something impressive enough, they'd have no choice but to respect me. And in many ways, I did exactly that. I studied hard, earned scholarships, landed internships, and eventually carved a career out of code and caffeine, building apps that solved problems most people didn't even know they had. By 30, I had helped sell 2 companies, both for more money than my parents would ever see in a lifetime. But none of that seemed to matter. My success didn't fit their narrative. They didn't understand it, and worse, they didn't try to. My mother once asked me, at a Christmas dinner in front of the entire table, if I was still doing that computer thing, like I was toying with a hobby instead of running my own business. Meanwhile, Melissa was becoming the kind of adult they understood: wife, mother, hostess of themed birthday parties, buyer of decorative pillows. She baked cookies from scratch and called our parents every other day with updates about teething and preschools and Pinterest ideas for home organization. They adored her for it. My father beamed when he said her name. My mother printed her Facebook posts and put them on the fridge. That was the part that hurt the most. Not the fact that they loved her, but that they had no interest in loving me on terms they didn't create. They didn't want to see who I was. They wanted to mold me into who they believed I should be. And when I refused, when I started setting boundaries and keeping my distance, they labeled it coldness, ungratefulness, emotional immaturity. At some point, I stopped reaching for their validation. I stopped updating them on promotions, stopped inviting them to conferences where I was the keynote speaker. I stopped trying to impress people who had already decided that I was disappointing by default. But even then, even with all that growth, something inside me never fully settled. Because it's one thing to say you don't need someone's approval, it's another thing entirely to stop aching for it. That ache is persistent. It's slippery. It creeps back in through the cracks when you least expect it. I had a therapist once who told me that children raised in emotionally withholding households often grow up seeing themselves like ghosts in a house of mirrors. You think you're seeing your reflection, but really you're seeing everyone else's version of you, twisted, stretched, blurred, until you start believing that's the only shape you can take. She told me that until I stopped trying to fit into their idea of who I should be, I'd never feel real. And God, she was right. I spent years performing for people who wouldn't even clap. I gave them everything I had to offer: my obedience, my silence, my success, and in return, they gave me polite indifference and constant reminders that I had failed to be enough. That was the context behind the envelope I handed my father. That was the emotional scaffolding beneath every line of that will. It wasn't an act of vengeance. It was an assertion of truth, a declaration that I would no longer write them into my story, just because they shared my blood. I was done pretending the absence of cruelty was the same as love. I was done being the ghost child haunting the corners of family photos. As I stood there in their kitchen, watching the fallout unfold in slow motion, I felt something shift inside me. Not relief exactly, not pride. Something simpler: space. A kind of internal exhale. I had done the thing I never thought I would do. I had let go of the idea that someday, if I just performed the right version of myself, they would finally say the words I had waited my whole life to hear. My father looked up from the paper, still stunned, still searching for something to anchor himself to. I could see it in his eyes. He wanted to ask if I was serious, if it was too late to fix it. But the truth hung in the air between us like a curtain pulled back. There was nothing left to fix. The damage wasn't recent. It had been slow, patient, consistent. And now it was permanent. "Is this really necessary?" he asked finally. Voice rough, brittle with disbelief. I didn't answer right away. I just studied his face, the man who raised me without ever really seeing me, and wondered, not for the first time, what it must feel like to be loved so automatically that you never have to ask why. "Necessary?" I said at last. "Maybe not, but honest? Absolutely." He didn't respond. He just looked down again, folding the document like it might behave differently the second time. My mother said nothing, her face unreadable. The silence between us deepened. But for once, I didn't try to fill it. I let it hang there, heavy and unspoken, like every missed birthday call, an overlooked report card, an unacknowledged milestone. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't even hurt. I was simply done. And that, more than anything, was what made them finally look at me like they didn't recognize who I had become. The strange thing about putting your intentions into writing, especially something as final and formal as a legal document, is how it forces you to face yourself with brutal, unrelenting honesty. There's no posturing in a will, no room for sugarcoating or emotional nuance. It becomes a blueprint for your absence, the final draft of your life as seen through transactions, instructions, and allocations. When I sat down to write mine, months before Melissa's baby shower, I didn't do it out of spite or a desire to make a statement, at least not consciously. It began as a practical task. I had built a life worth protecting, assets worth directing, and I didn't want them to end up in the hands of people who never made space for the person I had become. But as I wrote each section, line by line, what started as a functional exercise turned into something else entirely. It became a quiet rebellion, a manifesto in legalese, a love letter to everyone who had supported me in ways my family never had, and by contrast, a pointed silence aimed at those who hadn't. What my father read that day wasn't a surprise to me. It was a copy, not the original, and I knew every word like the back of my hand. It began with the usual declarations, dry and expected. I, Claire Elizabeth Johnson, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament. But it didn't take long for the tone to shift. The first item addressed my savings and investments. Not a fortune in the Hollywood sense, but enough to turn heads in any family not accustomed to wealth. It was allocated to 3 charities I had spent years quietly supporting, an organization that helped low-income girls pursue STEM careers, a legal fund for women escaping abusive households, and a local scholarship program I had helped launch for first-generation college students. There was no dramatic flair, no justification offered. Just names, account numbers, amounts, precise, final. The second section named beneficiaries for my personal belongings. My closest friend, Nadia, who once helped me move apartments in the rain without ever asking for anything in return, was to receive a necklace I had worn every day during my first company launch, as well as the rights to my digital archives, journals, unpublished code, and personal notes. My goddaughter, Eva, would receive a small annual stipend until she turned 25, along with a series of letters I had begun writing the year she was born, each one dated on her birthday, detailing the things I had learned that year, about life, about people, about what it meant to live on your own terms. Then the third section, the one that stopped my father's hands mid-fold, the one that made my mother's mouth draw into a thin, hard line. In that part of the document, I addressed what would not be given. I stated plainly that my parents were to receive nothing. Not because they were unworthy in the traditional sense, but because they had never asked who I was beyond the image they constructed. They had never shown curiosity about the shape of my life, the paths I had chosen, the ways I had grown beyond the boundaries they set for me. And while I could understand, even empathize with, the limitations of their generation, their upbringing, their worldview, I could no longer justify continuing a cycle that required me to shrink in order to be loved. Underneath that section, I included a note, not required, not legal, but deeply necessary. I wrote, "There comes a time when a person must choose whether to live for approval or for truth. I have chosen truth. I do not carry anger toward those excluded from this document, but I do carry clarity. My life was never a blank canvas for your expectations. It was a story I had to write for myself, often in silence, often without applause, and I am proud of what I built, even if you never learned how to read it. It was perhaps the most honest thing I had ever written, and it was also the most painful, because no matter how many boundaries I set, no matter how successful I became, some part of me still ached when I imagined their reactions. I didn't want them to hurt. I wanted them to understand. But that was the core of our lifelong disconnect. They interpreted discomfort as punishment, when it was really just the cost of truth. Back in the kitchen, after the reading of the will had cracked the surface of that perfectly curated afternoon, the air had thickened into something tense and brittle. My father set the document down slowly, like he wasn't sure if it would snap in half just from being touched. My mother stood still, arms crossed, her mouth working like she was trying to summon the right words but coming up short. I waited because I had nothing left to say that wasn't already written, but silence, especially in families like mine, has always been more dangerous than rage. It forces people to see what they've ignored. Finally, my mother spoke, and her voice came out calm but tight, the kind of tone she used when she was trying not to cry or scream. "I don't understand what we did to deserve this," she said, her eyes fixed on the kitchen tiles rather than me. "We did our best." That sentence, those 4 words, "we did our best," have become the anthem of emotionally negligent parents everywhere. They throw it like a shield, an all-purpose excuse for everything they refuse to examine. I could have responded in so many ways. I could have listed every moment of neglect, every passive-aggressive comment, every time they chose Melissa's comfort over my pain. I could have pointed out how Melissa never once had to explain herself, while I spent 3 decades trying to earn eye contact. But I didn't, because she wouldn't have heard me anyway. Instead, I nodded slowly. "Maybe you did," I said. "But your best was built on a version of me that never existed, and I got tired of living inside it." My father opened his mouth like he wanted to say something, maybe to defend himself, maybe to attack. But nothing came out. He just looked down again at the paper that now lay between us like a verdict. Melissa from the hallway called out, "What's going on? Are we taking more pictures?" I turned toward the sound of her voice, saw her standing with one hand on her belly and the other on the banister, eyes wide and slightly annoyed. She still didn't know. She hadn't seen the document. She had no idea what had just transpired in the kitchen where her cupcakes waited on glass trays, and that somehow made it feel even more final. The world had kept spinning. The party had resumed. The sun was still shining through the window. "I think we're done," I said, mostly to myself. Then I picked up my bag, straightened my blouse, and walked past my parents without looking back. I left the envelope on the table. They could keep it, or burn it, or pretend it never happened. But I knew they wouldn't forget it, not because of the money, but because it was the first time in my life that I had looked them both in the eye and said, without apology, that their version of love had never been enough. There is a strange kind of peace that follows a rupture, not the euphoric kind people talk about when they romanticize cutting ties or finally speaking their truth, but a quieter, more disorienting calm, like the air after a long storm when the streets are still wet and the silence feels just a little too heavy. That was how it felt when I stepped outside my parents' house, the baby shower still echoing faintly behind me, laughter, clinking glasses, the rustle of tissue paper, and the unmistakable hum of a family continuing as if nothing had changed. I closed the door behind me without slamming it, without looking over my shoulder, and I walked to my car with a strange mixture of clarity and detachment, as though I had just stepped out of someone else's story and wasn't quite sure what mine looked like anymore. The afternoon light was beginning to soften, casting long shadows across the pavement as I sat in the driver's seat for a few minutes without starting the engine. I watched the house through the windshield, not expecting anyone to come after me, but not entirely ruling it out either. No one did. And I realized, with a kind of hollow acceptance, that of course no one would. The story was already being rewritten inside, shaped by my parents, and likely retold by Melissa within hours. I could picture it all so clearly, the narrative twisting subtly, recasting me as the dramatic, unstable sister who chose the exact wrong moment to make a scene, who brought legal paperwork to a baby shower as if that were normal, who made it all about her because she couldn't stand not being the center of attention. They'd shake their heads, pour another glass of rosé, and reassure each other that they had done everything they could. After all, some people are just impossible to please. It didn't even make me angry anymore. I had outgrown the need to be defended in rooms I wasn't invited into. I didn't need to be the hero of their stories. I just needed to stop playing the villain in mine. When I finally started the car, the low hum of the engine felt like an anchor, a tether pulling me back to reality. I drove slowly at first, not out of hesitation, but because I needed to feel each moment pass, needed to mark the shift from one chapter of my life to another. There was no dramatic music, no cinematic montage of memories, just the sound of tires on asphalt and the soft rush of wind through the slightly cracked window. And in that ordinary silence, something inside me settled in a way it never had before. I didn't go home right away. Instead, I drove for nearly an hour, taking turns without a destination, letting the city unfold around me in unfamiliar ways. Eventually, I pulled into a quiet overlook, one of those places with just enough elevation to make the world below look small and manageable. I got out of the car, walked to the edge of the guardrail, and stood there for a while, letting the late afternoon breeze wash over me, the envelope still sitting untouched in the passenger seat, one copy of a decision that had taken years to write and even longer to arrive at. I thought about calling Nadia. She would have understood, she always did, but something held me back, something about the need to sit with what had just happened, to not dilute it with conversation or comfort. There are moments in life that require solitude, not because you're alone, but because the weight of them belongs entirely to you. This was one of those moments. I had made my choice, delivered my truth, and walked away without a single raised voice or slammed door. It had been surgical, controlled, deliberate. But that didn't mean it hadn't hurt. Because the truth is, part of me still wanted someone, anyone, to come after me, to say they hadn't realized, to admit they were wrong. Not because I needed revenge, but because I still carried that little girl inside me who had waited years for someone to show up for her. And even though I knew better, even though I had built a life on knowing better, that part of me still existed. She was just quieter now. I stayed there until the sun began to dip below the horizon, the sky bleeding into soft oranges and purples, and I thought about all the versions of myself I had shed over the years. The obedient daughter, the overlooked sister, the woman who mistook being needed for being loved. They were all gone now. Ghosts that had haunted me into adulthood, finally exorcised by the most unlikely of tools. A notarized document and a moment of silence at a party that wasn't mine. Eventually, I returned to my car, glanced again at the envelope on the seat beside me, and wondered whether I would actually file the official version or not. The one I had handed them was a copy, yes, but it was valid. The original, however, was still in my desk drawer, unsigned and unfiled, a placeholder for a future I hadn't fully committed to. I had written it in anger, revised it in sorrow, and delivered it in clarity. But what came next, what truly came next, was still undecided, because there was a difference between walking away and closing the door, and I hadn't yet decided whether mine should be left ajar or bolted shut. I thought about Melissa too, about how little she had understood what just happened, She had lived her entire life without ever questioning the shape of our family, without ever wondering whether someone else might have needed more than what was given. It wasn't her fault entirely. She had simply inherited the role she was cast into and played it well. I didn't hate her, I didn't envy her, but I had no interest in continuing to orbit around her sun. As the last light faded and the first stars began to prick the sky, I made a silent promise to myself, not to live in reaction to others, not to define my worth by their ability to recognize it, and certainly not to let their story be the only one that survived. I would write my own version, not in legal language or carefully worded clauses, but in the way I chose to live, in the people I kept close, and in the places I gave my time and love. I drove home with the windows down, the envelope still unopened beside me, and the night stretching ahead like a blank page. There was no epiphany waiting at the end, no neat moral to wrap around the pain like a ribbon, just a quiet knowing, just the weight of a truth finally spoken, and the long, slow exhale of someone who had spent too long holding her breath. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Or maybe it wasn't. Maybe the silence would stretch, and the ache would return, and I would question all of it again in a week or a year or a decade. But for now, in that moment, with the cool air in my lungs and the hum of the road beneath me, it felt like a beginning, not of reconciliation, not of forgiveness, just of freedom. And that was more than I had ever expected.